What's the deal between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads? Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads, both are guitar legends, innovators who influenced generations of rock guitar players. Randy Rhoads was a great influence on heavy metal guitar players of the 80s like John Sykes, Michael Angelo Batio, who I jammed with, Zakk Wylde, just to name a few. And of course, Eddie Van Halen influenced just about every guitar player out there. His tone and techniques, everybody wanted to get his guitars and amps and play like him, including myself. So, what's the deal? Why Randy Rhoads and Eddie Van Halen didn't get along very well? Why, when Randy was killed in the airplane crash, Eddie said, "Everything he did, he learned from me. And I don't really think he did anything I haven't done," which of course sounds delusional. Well, Randy Rhoads started the competition first. He trolled Eddie and made smart comments about his playing. Here's what happened. In 1976 or 77, Rhoads first saw Van Halen and came away from the show devastated, according to former girlfriend Jan. The very first time Randy Rhoads saw Van Halen in 76 or 77, he took his girlfriend Jan with him. Jan later said that Randy was devastated after the show. Here he was, the king of Burbank. Everyone was always telling him how great he was. Seeing Eddie Van Halen play was a real eye opener for him. But he was also inspired by what he saw and heard. He thought Van Halen was amazing, and he wanted to be amazing as well. This is what Randy's friend Kelly Garney said. "We first heard about Van Halen when they were still known as Mammoth. They were playing parties down in Pasadena. We'd hear rumors of how there was this great loud band down there, and Randy eventually got his girlfriend to drive him down to one of the parties to hear them. I asked him how they were when he came back, but all he would say was that they were pretty good." The band that Randy was in, Quiet Riot, and Van Halen played on the same bill at Glendale College in April 1977. Quiet Riot opened. Van Halen was the headliner. Randy approached Eddie and asked him how he was able to keep his guitar in tune without a locking nut for his tremolo. And Eddie refused to tell him. He said it was his own secret. This came as a bit of a shock for Randy. He loved to help others, and he was always willing to share anything he knew. He would teach anyone anything they wanted to learn. So he was quite disappointed in Eddie's treatment of him. It must have been like a verbal slap in the face. At a 1982 guitar clinic, Randy was asked, "There are critics who accuse you of copying Eddie Van Halen. Are you influenced by him?" And this is what Randy replied. "Well, we're both from the same town, and we were both in local bands. It seemed like everybody in LA was a lead guitar player, and we all played very similarly. Everybody used to say we all sounded very much the same. However, it sounds pretty fishy that a bunch of guys suddenly all came out at the same time and started to play similarly and sound the same. Somebody had to start the ball rolling. And of course, that somebody was Eddie Van Halen. Actually, in 1977, the three local bands, Van Halen, Quiet Riot, and The Boys, rocked Hollywood bars and clubs like the Starwood and Whiskey in Los Angeles. Lynch played in a band called The Boys, working the Sunset Strip clubs in Hollywood alongside some of their contemporaries like Van Halen and Quiet Riot. Around that time, Randy commented on Eddie Van Halen's playing. "Eddie's playing is mostly smoke and mirrors. You want to see a guy who can really play and play good? Watch George Lynch. He's an amazing player." Mammoth, Van Halen, opened for George's band when he first saw Eddie play. George's band was supposed to get signed that night, but they got blown off stage by Van Halen. It's a famous local story here in the Hollywood area. George said afterwards that he either needed to quit guitar altogether or get lessons from this guy. It set George back a few years. The Boys were in fact to play a showcase for Gene Simmons of Kiss and his startup label. Van Halen opened the show, and Gene opted not to stay and see the boys. After this, Lynch formed Exciter before joining Dokken. Twice, Lynch auditioned for the position of Ozzy Osbourne's lead guitarist, once in 1979, losing to Randy Rhoads, and another time in 1982 to replace Brad Gillis. According to Lynch, he was hired for 3 days before Ozzy changed his mind and decided to go with Jakey Lee. I personally tried to audition for Ozzy when Zakk Wylde won that particular gig. Anyway, I sent my photo and demo to Ozzy, and he never called me. Now, George Lynch made his name much later in the 80s. People started hearing about Lynch 4 or 5 years after the first Van Halen album was out, and he's considered the 80s wave of guitar shredders after Eddie. So, Randy Rhoads dissed Eddie's playing by calling it smoke and mirrors and claimed that George Lynch was a better player. But in 2009, George Lynch himself revealed that they were all jealous of Eddie Van Halen in the late 70s. And this is what George Lynch said: "We were jealous and we were all trying to play catch up. We thought, oh boy, we'd better get on board. This guy's going to change the world." I remember my reaction when I first heard Eddie. I had been hearing about this guy with the weird European name. He's got a torpedo on the stage. The bass player wears clogs. They have bombs on stage, and the guy's unbelievable. I saw him, and it blew my mind. They were still doing covers at the time, Rainbow, Montrose, and their original stuff was as good or better than their cover stuff, which was pretty exceptional. After their show, I went back to our band room and played my guitar until the sun came up. I thought, man, how can I get that tone? In 2022, George Lynch said that Eddie Van Halen was a huge influence on him. Randy wasn't an influence on George, but Eddie was an influence on Randy as well. It was like Jimi Hendrix, who came and changed how everybody played guitar. Eddie was setting the bar. Everybody wanted to be as great as Eddie. Actually, during an interview in the 80s, when Eddie was asked, "How did you learn to play so fast?" he sarcastically replied, "I don't play very fast, actually. It's all mirrors, you know."
Where did you learn to play so fast? You lock yourself up in a room and...
I don't play very fast, actually. It's all mirrors, you know.
In 1981, Randy Rhoads was interviewed by journalist John Styx. John asked, "You didn't go through an imitation innovation stage. Most people start with imitation." To which Randy Rhoads replied, "To be honest, I wish I could agree with you. Even now, everything happens so fast in this band that I haven't had enough time to really think what I want to do. For instance, I do a solo live, Suicide Solutions, and I do a lot of things that Eddie Van Halen does. And it kills me that I do that. It's just flash, and it impresses the kids. And I'm trying to make a name as fast as I can. I wish I could take time and come up with something that nobody has done, but unfortunately, it will take me a few years." Here, Randy admits that he uses stuff that Eddie Van Halen does, but he disses it, calling it just flash. Sounds disrespectful to Eddie Van Halen. Randy played his guitar solo spot, Suicide Solutions, to impress the audience, but he didn't want to be considered as Eddie's clone, and he definitely wanted to separate himself from Eddie comparisons live. Here is a story from Randy Rhoads' biography by Andrew Klein. Makes it seem like Eddie was up on what Randy was doing. When Randy was home on break from Ozzy tour, he decided to drive to his local music store to buy some classical albums. Randy said that when he walked into the record store, Eddie Van Halen was standing online at the register purchasing the Diary of a Madman album. Does this story seem plausible to you? So in 1982, at the height of his career, Eddie Van Halen goes to the record store at the exact same time and location as Randy Rhoads goes to buy an Ozzy record, presumably because he really needs to hear what Randy Rhoads was doing. Couldn't he have sent someone out to pick it up? Sounds more like the story was made up to troll Eddie. In 1977, they all played clubs, but the first Van Halen got huge success, and a few years later, Ozzy's band broke big, and people started to talk about Randy and his guitar style. And Eddie was aware of that. He said that he'd read some interviews with Randy. That means that he was interested and wanted to know what was Randy doing. People who knew Randy said that Eddie Van Halen was one of Randy's favorite players who pushed him to become better. Audio producer Max Norman, who worked on Blizzard of Oz in 1980, recalled, Van Halen was one of the few guitarists Randy would talk about. One day I asked him, what guitar players do you like, Randy? And he said, I like Eddie Van Halen. I had never seen Eddie play, so when Randy started doing all the finger tapping stuff, it was all new to me. But Randy didn't cop Eddie's licks. He just picked up on some of his ideas and methods of playing. It's only natural to get something from someone else. All guitarists do it. Randy's friend Rudy Sarzo said, later on, he came to really admire Gary Moore and Eddie Van Halen. Those were his top two guys. Randy Rhoads himself commented on Eddie Van Halen, saying, Eddie is great. I don't want to get near competing with people like that. In another interview, he also said, Eddie Van Halen is fantastic. On the 2nd of February, 1982, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, a fan asked Randy Rhoads at a guitar clinic. Fan. I've heard a lot of rumors that you're just copying off Eddie Van Halen. Was you influenced by him? His technique in playing? Crowd makes comments to fan. Fan. No. Was you influenced by him or Randy Rhoads? Yeah, I was actually. So Randy admitted that Eddie Van Halen was an influence. Randy used to pick up Van Halen riffs and teach kids how to play them. But he didn't copy Eddie Van Halen's solo notes for note, and he didn't use Eddie's licks in his solos. But he did his own stuff, like Max Norman said. He just picked up on some of his ideas and methods of playing. So after Randy was killed in the airplane crash, Eddie talked about Randy in an interview. Here is that part of the interview. Interviewer, what do you think of Randy Rhoads? Eddie, well, he was one guitarist who was honest anyway, because I read some interviews that he did. He said that everything he did he learned from me, and he was good. Interviewer, he was the first one to come along after you and sort of inspire the sort of worshiping the guys out there. Eddie, oh sure, but I don't really think he did anything that I haven't done. What do you think? Interviewer, he's a little different, but I hear a lot of you in him. The first time I ever heard him, I thought it was a copy of you. Eddie, yeah, that's what I mean. It's just like anyone else who does the things that I do is obviously going to sound a little different, but it's still, I could tell when someone's copying my technique, but there's nothing wrong with that. I learned from other people too. Interviewer, yeah, it's just something that people hear and they like and they want it. Eddie, sure, there's nothing wrong with it. Man, I've copied other people back. So the statement, everything he did he learned from me, sounds pretty pompous. Randy did his own stuff. But anyway, Eddie admits that Randy was good, though they were no big friends. There was a professional rivalry. They were like Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore. Eddie was Jimmy and Randy was Ritchie. Both are legends and innovators. But Eddie was also like Jimi Hendrix. He set everyone on fire in 1978.